read of your bio. All right, so thank you everyone for coming to this talk today by Isabelle Augenstein. She's actually here. She's been here for a week and she'll spend another few days here at KAIST. Isabelle is a professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark in the Department of Computer Science, and she heads the Copenhagen NLP or NLU, Natural Language Understanding Research Group, as well as the Natural Language Processing section. Her main research interests are fair and accountable NLP, including challenges such as explainability, factuality, and data detection. Oh, I'm sorry, bias detection. So prior to starting faculty position, she was a postdoc at UCL in London, and before that, she was a PhD student at the University of Sheffield. In October 2022, she became the youngest ever female full professor in Denmark, and she currently holds 2 very prestigious research fellowships, an ERC starting grant on explainable and robust automatic fact-checking, as well as a DFF Sapir Odd Research Leader Fellowship on learning to explain attitudes on social media. She's a member of the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters, and she's the current president of SIGDAT, which is responsible for the entire EMNLP conference. So we're very happy and honored to have Isabelle, who is working on sharing her slides again. And the title of her talk today is, Parametric, revealing the parametric knowledge of language models. All right, so let's give a big round of applause for Isabelle.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, so I'm happy to be here at KAIST. We actually arrived last week and we were in Seoul first, and then the week before last, and Daejeon last week, and we'll be in Daejeon still this week, and then going back to Seoul for a workshop there. So I'm also here with my 2 PhD students, Jingy and Haun, and some of the work I'll be presenting will be Haun's PhD work. So if you have some more detailed questions later, you're also welcome to come talk to us then. All right. So the broad topic of my talk is factuality, which is something that I hope all of you will be familiar with. And just to motivate this, when ChatGPT was released, one of the first things that my PhD students did, which I'm sure many of you did as well, is to ask, who is Isabelle Augenstein? And it generated some coherent text that sounded quite convincing, but then upon further inspection, it turned out that only some of it was actually true. So you can see the true bits in green, the false bits in red, and the maybe somewhere in between bits in yellow, where I'm not sure I would agree with it or not myself. But yes, and all of this, the fact that it sounds quite convincing, but there are factual inaccuracies in this generated text by language models has inspired a lot of research, including ours in the recent year or two. So what are some of these factuality challenges? The first thing is that there are citation gaps. So when you generate some articles, you can ask for citations, of course. Sometimes they exist when you then look them up, and sometimes they don't exist. And the fact that this can't be checked is really an issue. Then there is also an issue with grounding. So for some of these things that require grounding or require more detailed descriptions of some, for example, strategies or so on, or some strategic or specialized summaries, they don't work so well. Then one of the things I'm very interested in is truthfulness, which I've already tried to motivate. There is an issue with truthfulness in these automatically generated texts. Then the confident tone as well, even if it's untrue, that generated text always sounds very confident. It's also very fluent, so it's very good at grammar, getting things grammatically correct. Then there is this halo effect. So ChatGPT is quite good at some topics, but not so good at others, especially more domain-specific topics. But this then creates a halo effect, meaning that people think just because ChatGPT and other language models can generate factually correct text in some areas, it's just going to be useful for everything. Then also outdated knowledge, these language models, they're outdated quite quickly, and the question becomes, how can they be updated? How can they be maintained? And unreliable evaluation, which means that we can use existing benchmarks that we already have in natural language processing and try to judge the accuracy of language models on those, but the language models will likely be polluted with the test sets already. They will have likely seen the test sets already, meaning that the evaluation isn't reliable. So we have to come up with new test sets, and again, the language models will eventually end up being trained on those. So it's a bit unclear how to evaluate them. And then the last thing, or the overarching thing, is that users use these language models directly. And so it's from the outside, the information that reaches them can't really be controlled. So they might receive all of this false information, but there's no way of intercepting this and correcting it. So yes, truthfulness and unreliable evaluation are two of the challenges that we're working on in the lab mostly. So in the next maybe 15 minutes, I will tell you a little bit about some of the earlier research we did on this, maybe 1.5 years ago now, on postdoc detection and correction of factual errors. And the idea was that you directly work with the automatically generated text. You assume you don't have any access to the underlying language model, and you try to correct this information and treat it as a fact-checking task. Then more recently, we've looked into probing the parametric knowledge of language models. This assumes you have access to the language models. You can actually access them and try to understand Okay, was it turned off? Okay. Oh, I'm really sorry. Is it okay now? Okay. All right. Okay, let's continue. Yes, and then of course I'll wrap up at the end. Right. So for those of you who've not worked on fact-checking, just a brief recap of the conventional fact-checking pipeline. So conventionally, you have some kind of claim and you want to know, should it be checked or not? There are some things which should obviously be checked. For example, in political campaigns, politicians make all kinds of campaign promises. That's something you want to check, or that they say maybe the economy has grown or something else has happened and therefore we should do this or that. And then there are also other claims. Maybe you want to say a banana can be yellow. Maybe that's not something that needs to be checked because it's just common knowledge. Then the next stage is typically evidence document retrieval, where given these claims, you want to get some evidence. It can be from just using a search engine. It can be a more specialized search engine like Google Scholar if you're dealing with scientific knowledge. And then stance detection, textual entailment, where you want to know how does the evidence relate to the claim, given the evidence is the, what does it say about, does it support the claim, does it deny the claim, does it question the claim, or so on. And then veracity prediction, given all of these different stance predictions together, is the claim overall true or false, or is there not enough information? And now to some degree, we can use the automatically generated text and existing fact-checking pipeline and treat it in the same way. But it doesn't work all too well because these texts are usually quite long. So they're not just a single claim. So that's one of the issues. And the other one is that claim checkworthiness detection also works differently because with ChatGPT, with other language models, you want to also maybe check some of the more common sense things that it can generate. Maybe it would generate that a banana can be red. We don't know. Hopefully it would know that a banana can't be red, but on the inside at least. So yes. Another thing is that most existing data sets are only annotated for veracity prediction, not for the intermediate steps like evidence, reliability, or evidence relevance. And then the other thing is that some evidence can also only partially support a claim, and typically that's not something that is annotated or that's taken into account. Yes, the other thing is when we're dealing with machine-generated text, we also ideally want to have correction of the text, not just detection of whether it's correct or not. There have been some efforts on LLM-based fact-checking where people have introduced previous data sets, but they have not included the correction parts. And I believe they were also a bit smaller than the ones we are presenting. We've worked on. All right, so we have this data set that we're proposing and also this pipeline and annotation framework and also some results on this data set for a holistic fine-grained framework for detecting the factuality of LLM outputs. And we also correct factual errors, so we also have corrections annotated. And the annotation tool, it can also be used for building other data sets. So I'm not sure how well you can see this. I can see the screen is a little bit blurry, but I will read it out. So the first thing we start with is a response generated by a language model. And then we want to split this into sentences and decontextualize it, so to resolve pronouns and so forth. Then we want to know which one of these are check-worthy claims and which ones are statements we should just ignore. Right. Then we want to retrieve and collect evidence. Then we want to identify the stances of the evidence documents towards the atomic claims, the new, when we split the whole generated text into several individual claims. And then we want to check if anything should be corrected. So for each of the atomic claims, should they be corrected or not? Then we actually want to do the edits and then we want to remerge it. So you can see there are a lot more steps than for the traditional fact-checking pipeline. Yes. And so our data set contains all of these annotations. We start by collecting some data, of course. We use two different sources. So one is an existing data set that's used for fine-tuning large language models. And then we also manually collect some commonly reported factual errors of large language models. And we do this because we actually want to have a data set that contains a lot of things that can go wrong in language models if we just end up or start with using lots of easy examples, then it's not going to be such a useful data set. We also do some automatic filtering of the data afterwards. Yes, then we did a lot of different rounds of this annotation process. The first one we thought we would be to do everything manually. So we manually look for evidence, we manually do the splitting and so forth. This ended up taking a really, really long time. So then what we decided to do was to automatically suggest some annotations, but then to refine them. So one thing is that ChatGPT, which we used, is quite good at decomposing responses into atomic claims. So then we would just have to do some small refinements. Maybe sometimes some pronouns wouldn't be resolved or such. And that would already be much, much faster than doing it automatically. We also used some combination of ChatGPT and Google search to get evidence pages. And then we use SentenceBird to actually rank them and get the top 5 evidence pages. This also worked to some degree, but I have results later. It didn't work as well as we thought, this bit. So that's something that's still not working so well, this retrieval part. Yes, and with all of these things, we managed to cut down the annotation process to something like 15 to 30 minutes per instance, which is quite a bit better.
So is this, do you have like certain topics or is it just general?
It's just general topics. I remember that it contains all sorts of things from something like really, there was some academic questions, some general trivia questions, all kinds of things. Also, I mean, yeah, it's nothing specialized, really containing all sorts of domains. So yes. Okay, let me just check if there's anything important in the chat. Okay, no, it's all been resolved. Good. Okay. Then I also have some screenshots of the annotation interface. I can see again it's a bit blurry, so I'm not sure if I mean just on the screen. So maybe I will just skip that bit because I'm not sure you'll be able to see it anyway. But yes, I will share the slides later so you can have a look at it yourself if you're curious. But this is kind of how it looks like. We start with generated text, and for each of them we can click and then check, should it be is it relevant? Is it not relevant for check worthiness and so forth? You have some evidence. That's the evidence step. This is the correction step. Yes. Okay. Now this should be a bit easier to see again, the plots. So here are some analyses of the data set. So the first one is how long are these generated answers actually? So this is given a question like how does one, I don't know, how does one build a fire? Something like that. So they're between 1 and 10 sentences, with most of them being around maybe 3 to 4 sentences. Then how important are they? Most of them are important. Then do they contain check-worthy claims? Most of them do. That's also good. Then the number of atomic claims in a sentence, yes, around what is it, 2, 3? So this again needs to be broken down. Some of the claims contain several clauses. Now about the evidence, actually, if the evidence is sufficient or not. And this is depending on the, we can see here, we have completely support, partially support, refute, and irrelevant. And the blue bar is irrelevant. And actually, you can see that a lot of the evidence that's automatically retrieved ends up being irrelevant. So this means that evidence retrieval is still something that's very much not addressed for fact-checking or for question answering. If we actually use real claims and we actually use just web search. Okay. Yes, and then is the evidence sufficient or not? For most of them, it was sufficient, but we actually also found quite a lot for which the evidence wasn't sufficient. So where we actually couldn't find evidence where it was something that was quite a rare fact or something where you would actually have to ask a person to get the information. Yes, and then does the evidence support the claim? Again, we have something that's we have quite a few that were irrelevant. And does the claim need to be corrected? For most of them, they didn't need to be corrected, but then for about a third, they did need to be corrected. Okay, so this was the data set. We also have some preliminary numbers on that, where we just implemented the fact-checking pipeline, all of these steps, but they're not super, super interesting, I would say, so I will just skip these ones. Overall, if we implement a pipeline to automatically detect these factual inaccuracies. We get an F1 of 0.63, which is quite low, and there we use external knowledge as well. So there's still a lot that can be done. Automatically evaluating the edited responses is also quite different. Existing evaluation measures just don't work quite so well for that. And when we did a pilot of that, we also found that there wasn't, humans completely disagreed with the automatic measures we used. Yes, there are a lot of possibilities to extend this to more languages, to specialized domains, and so forth. Yes, and we have the dataset online, we have the framework online, so you can use it if it's relevant to any of you. But one of the takeaways for me was also really this about evidence retrieval, that's still something that very much needs to be worked on for fact checking and question answering. Okay, now I will move on to probing the parametric knowledge of language models. So let us assume we actually have access to the underlying models. We can actually check what kinds of mistakes they might contain. So then we want to know into the parametric knowledge, which is the knowledge that models acquire during training or during fine-tuning. And what we want to look at is the change in knowledge acquired by the language models between LLM training and LLM fine-tuning for specific supervised tasks. In this case, we care about knowledge-intensive tasks like question answering and fact-checking and natural language inference. Yes, and there are different attribution methods that can be used to reveal this parametric knowledge. And they exist on different levels, the instance level and the neuron level. And there has been prior work on these, and different kinds of methods have been proposed, but they've mainly been studied in isolation, and they've not been evaluated against one another. So it's difficult to say which ones of these work. And there's no consensus as to when they work or in which scenarios they work or why they work. So we have this unified evaluation framework to try to compare these methods against one another to improve our collective understanding of when they work, hopefully. So one is instance attribution, one type of attribution method, and this is about finding training instances that influence the parametric knowledge used by the model. And it's quite easy for humans to interpret because it actually says that these are the influential training instances. So you don't need to know a lot about neural networks to understand what this means. It's quite easy to show to end users, and it can also be used to, for example, debias the model or to detect some kinds of artifacts in the data set that shouldn't be there. Then we have neuron attribution, which locates specific neurons that hold the most important parametric knowledge. And this is quite a fine-grained view of which neurons influence the prediction, but it can also be useful because you can then look at the different functions of these neurons and try to do knowledge editing, for example. But I would say that this is more useful to people who actually work with developing and fine-tuning models as opposed to actual end users. Then what we did is we thought, could it not be possible and would it not be useful to actually align these two methods with one another? Do they discover a similar kind of knowledge, or do they discover different knowledge? And so we did two different things. One is we started with the instances, the most important instances. And given the most important instances, we then found the most important neurons within these instances. The other one is we did it the other way around. We started with the most important neurons and tried to understand which important instances are they related to. And so we have two different ways of combining them, and then we can look at if this actually results in the same kind of knowledge, if there is an overlap between these. Okay, and we evaluate this in two different ways. One is we do neuron attribution faithfulness tests, So for faithfulness tests, we have two different ones which are commonly used. It's called they're called sufficiency and comprehensiveness. And for sufficiency, we try to remove the neurons, or we remove the neurons that aren't deemed as being important. And for the comprehensiveness, we do the opposite. Then for fine-tuning with influential training instances, it's maybe also quite intuitive. So we identify which the influential training instances are, and then we just select these for fine-tuning for our, for example, fact-checking model. And then we see if the performance is similar to if we use all of the instances, maybe, or what the gap is. Because maybe there are a lot of instances that aren't needed. Okay. Yeah, and we use different kinds of instance attribution methods. One is called influence function, the other one is called gradient similarity, and then for neuron attribution, we use integrated gradient. And we use 3 different data sets, one for fact-checking, one for natural language inference, and one for question answering. And we use 3 open source language models for that. And I will just show the results of one of the language models because actually the results were quite similar. So first for sufficiency, and there the higher results are better, and this is for the OPT model. Just to recap the methods that we used. So one is random. So for random, we randomly select the same number of neurons. We just have some specific number, and we select that. For sufficiency, we use the top 1 important neuron, and for comprehensiveness, we use the top 100 neurons. And we could have used a different number. We actually did experiment with different numbers, but this is kind of quite extreme. That for sufficiency, we only want to use the top 1 important neuron to see if that actually, if that is actually really important, and how important is it. Then for comprehensiveness, that the lower numbers are better. And so what you can see with sufficiency is that the results are actually quite similar, which is very surprising to us. So if we only use the top 1 neuron, then we actually get quite similar results to if we selected a random neuron. And that was the most surprising thing to us. And that only 1 neuron can recover the prediction with above 70% accuracy. And our hypothesis based on this was that this is due to the role of the attention weights, which we kept exactly as they were. So these are really just the neurons from the MLP layer. So this is something that we want to look at in future work. Okay, yeah, for comprehensiveness, we see the same thing, just reversed. And we have the same behavior across all the data sets. Yes, then we can also do this fine-tuning experiment with influential training instances. And yeah, again, another interesting thing is that if we use the least important, the least important neurons, then we get better performance than with all the other methods. So this is where we first used the neurons, and based on neurons, we selected the instances. That one shows better performance than the other least methods, where we use, for example, influence function and I have least. So that shows quite good performance, and the performance is actually quite close to when we use the most important instances. And so we were wondering, why could that be? It seems quite counterintuitive. And the hypothesis that we came up with is that it's maybe relates to the diversity of the selected instances. So maybe if you select the most important instances, then all of the instances would be quite similar to one another. And then if you just fine tune on these, then the model won't have a lot of useful signals. Whereas if you use the least important ones, then maybe they will be more diverse. Maybe the dataset is just of such a good quality that selecting the least important training instances still means that they're quite useful. Yes, but the last thing isn't something that we directly. So this this was it for the input attribution methods. Now I will tell you a little bit about some more recent work we did on detecting knowledge conflicts of language models. And this is a different way of probing the parametric knowledge of language models. So what kinds of knowledge conflicts can there be? Well, one is that there can be intra-memory conflict. So this is when within the language model, within the language model's representations, there are two different somehow answers for the same question you can think. So maybe someone was prime minister at a certain date, and then someone else became prime minister. So you have these kind of two things which are in conflict with one another. The other thing is then context memory conflict. And this means that you have some knowledge stored in the language model, and you have some evidence document which actually tells you something else. Maybe the document is more recent, or maybe it contains some errors. It could be anything, really. And these two things, they cause conflicts. And so here we want to try to analyze this a little bit better. What we look at is two different sources of conflict. One is temporality, where things change over time, like with the prime minister. And the other thing is that there can be two different points of view, perhaps. And I will show you an example of that in the next slide, I believe, or the slide after that. Yes. And so we investigate the interaction between intra-memory conflicts and context memory conflicts. And we use natural causes of these conflicts, so not something that's made up, but we try to collect some actual examples of when this might change, like with the prime ministers and such. Now we have different hypotheses as to what these kinds of conflicts result in when it comes to language models. So popular facts, for example, I don't know, when someone was born, that has been shown to be quite stubbornly encoded in the language model. So language models are unlikely to change their predictions regarding that. So let's see, someone was born on a certain date, and it turns out at some point that the original source was wrong. Language models are unlikely to change their predictions given the context if you just provide a more updated evidence document to them. So then we also have unpopular facts, which are the temporarily changing or disputable facts. And language models, we think, might be more likely to be persuaded for these disputable or temporally changing facts because it already contains so many different answers in its parametric knowledge. That's our hypothesis. Yes, there is a lot of repetition. We have yes. Yeah. Yes. So this I kind of already said. So when it's temporally changing or disputable, then we can view this as being somehow more noisy, as there being more noise in the training set due to having multiple possible answers. And we can use semantic uncertainty measures to measure noise inherent in the training data set, and greater semantic uncertainty should then result in the model using the provided context. This is what we think. It should be more willing to use the provided context than if it's very sure about the fact. Okay, so we created this data set, which we call dynamic QA. Consists of a bit over 11,000 contexts and question pairs. You can also find it online if you want to have a look and play around with it. And we have two different contexts and answers for the same question, and we built this based on a combination of Wikidata and Wikipedia. So you can see an example of each of the different types of questions here. So we have the static facts. So who is the father of? That's something that's not going to change. The temporal facts, well, I had the one with the prime ministers earlier, but actually the one on the slide is about the capital. That's also something that can be changed, can change over time. And then disputable fact, which ethnic group is most commonly affected by lactose intolerance? And that's just a disputable fact because it's quite difficult to measure that. So a lot of it is about somehow perception rather than statistics, or statistics which somehow disagree with one another. Okay. So how do we build this data set? So for the static and temporal data sets, we build it based on an existing data set, which is called PopQA. And there we identify temporal QA and the static pair. So if the number of edits is 1, then it's bigger than 1, and it's a temporally changing fact, and otherwise it's a static fact. And for some context, we find sentences from the Wikipedia article that mention the object. Now, for disputable facts, we've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and we found this Wikipedia list of controversial articles, which is very interesting, by the way. I encourage you to have a look at it. It makes for quite an interesting read. And we examine the reverted edit logs to see if anyone has actually edited them, and to actually get the different possible answers. And so we identified the reverted words with the edit distance. We do some automatic filtering for vandalism, synonyms, and paraphrasing, because some people could just try to insert some maybe rude words or something else. And then we generate questions with a language model. So we actually start with the articles there, and based on the articles, we generate questions, whereas for the static and dynamic, static and tempo ones, we start with the questions, and we get the context from Wikipedia. Okay. We do this automatically. No, I think for identifying synonyms and paraphrasing, it's quite easy to do it automatically. For vandalism, it's a bit more difficult, and I'm not saying we definitely caught all of this, but that's also why we manually annotated the data set afterwards. It was just some pre-filtering to account for that. Okay. Now, we also want to have some measures for how disputable or how temporally affected these different questions are. So that's why for temporality, we looked at the number of edits. And for disputability, we looked at the occurrence of the pair of the reverted edit logs. For popularity, we looked at the number of monthly Wikipedia article views. And so that can give us an indication of how popular a fact is and how stubborn it should be. Yes. Okay. Then we want to measure the intra-memory conflict, as I said, and we use 2 different measures for that. One is for the intra-memory knowledge conflict, and for that we use something else called semantic uncertainty. Now, that's not a measure we proposed ourselves, but the idea is we just have the question, we pass to the language model, we generate some answers, and we want to know how much conflict is there between the answers. So what we want to do is we want to group the answers somehow into similar answers. And we do this using a natural language inference model, so that when we have answers which are essentially the same, that they appear in a similar group. And then we want to know if there are conflicts between these groups of answers. So in one group, we might have both dog and the dog, and then the other one, cat and cats, or something like that. And then we measure the entropy between these different sets. And that's then this measure of semantic uncertainty. All right. Then we have this context memory knowledge conflict. And the idea is that we have a question which is processed by the language model, and then we also have a variant where we have a context and a question, and we want to know the probability difference between these 2 different ones, because it can tell us to what degree the context changes to what degree the context has an impact on the persuasiveness. Okay. Right. So this is just a reminder of the different hypotheses that we had. So main hypothesis was that a greater semantic uncertainty should result in the model using the provided context, because when there is already uncertainty in the model, then it should want to use the evidence documents more, because it isn't as certain about the fact to start with. Okay. And so we generated, we tried our best to visualize this, and this is kind of what we came up with. I can now see that it looks a bit blurry on the screen. It doesn't look blurry on my screen, so it's a bit of a shame. But okay, so the stubborn instances are the ones that are black triangles. The orange ones are the ones that are persuaded instances. And then on the left, we have the intra-memory conflict ones, where we have semantic uncertainty without context. And on the right ones, we have context memory conflict, where we have the semantic uncertainty with context. And for stubborn instances, models show more certainty for both the intra-memory and the context memory conflict, which you can see by the black triangles appearing more to the left. And also the degree of uncertainty decreases with the presence of context for all of the instances. Overall, we find that semantic uncertainty does not indicate the persuasiveness of the context, which we found quite surprising, because prior work has shown that that holds. So we're a little bit unsure about why we actually found something that's contradictory with prior work. And that's something that we will still investigate in more detail. But the difference to prior work is that we actually use existing real-world data, whereas they used artificially generated data. So we would hope that future work will show that maybe using real data is a better indicator of this as a measure for knowledge conflicts. All right. So this I can skip, because I think I already said all of that just now. All right. Then to some overall wrap up and conclusions, just bringing this back to where I started. So large language models, they suffer from hallucinations and can mislead the public in several different ways. One of the things that we're working on in the lab is truthfulness and direct usage of misinformation, how this can be addressed. There are also all kinds of other challenges which are equally worth addressing, like lack of credible sourcing, which can maybe be done using retrieval-augmented language models, confident tone, fluent style to make sure that that doesn't influence readers, ease of access and the halo effect. Then language models being perceived as knowledge base. So this is more about somehow the perception of users again. And then unreliable evaluation, which is again something we want to address. Okay. Yes, there are lots of different threats which are posed by malicious language model usage, including personalized attacks, style impersonation, bypassing detection, and fake profiles, which can be generated quite easily. We have worked on detecting and correcting factual mistakes at inference time, and also better evaluation and explainability methods to try to detect changes in facts in language models, or also what neurons, what instances facts can be attributed to. There is much more that can be done. One thing I mentioned is retrieval augmentation. It's not something we're working on in the lab, but it's very much needed. Also recognizing AI-generated content, making language models safer in general, AI regulation, also, of course, public education regarding all of these different things that can go wrong when using language models. So yeah, this was it. So yeah, thank you for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions. And these are the papers. Yes.
I'll start out with people in Zoom can maybe, so maybe they can't hear. So I don't. Well, I'll ask the first question, but like for the other questions, since we don't have a wireless mic, maybe you can summarize and repeat the question when they ask. So the two types of when facts can change or are controversial, that's very interesting. But there can be other types as well, right? So you were talking about dynamic changes and you were talking about controversial topics or controversial facts. But there can be, geographic differences or just different perspectives, not really conflicts, but, so or controversial, but just different ways of looking at things or different definitions of what some of the concepts. So what are your thoughts on those?
Yes, I think that would fall into the category as well. We called it somehow controversial facts, but really I think it has quite similar patterns to things which change geographically. So again, I would think that that's something where a language model, where there's noise in the language model in the sense of there are different answers depending on what data it's trained on, of course. And so, yes, I think that's something that can be treated quite similarly from a technical perspective.
So all of those cases, how should evaluation?
So how should evaluation work? Yeah. Well, ideally, we would know all the different or all the possible answers, and we could just check if the answer that is generated is one of the different possible answers. But in practice, it of course doesn't work so well. Yes, I think some kind of human in the loop approach is always the best one, where something is generated and then you afterwards you try to ask evaluators if it's true or not, because it's difficult to think of all the right answers in advance sometimes. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm not sure. Of course, also with evaluation, if it's something that's somehow regionally or geographically sensitive, then trying to get evaluators from that region. But yeah. Yeah.
My question is that how broad the evaluation data set is. How many topics, facts are there?
So about the dynamic QA one? Oh, how many topics do we have? I don't think it's on the slide, and I don't remember if we did an analysis of the number of topics. How do you remember?
Like which fact?
Oh, okay. I'll just repeat it. Go ahead.
But they are unique facts. So there are no overlapping answers or overlapping questions. They are all, I think I can say they are all unique facts, like all the 10,000 instances, because we try, yeah, allow the duplicates among those.
Yeah, so the answer was they're all unique facts and there are no duplicates, but we didn't tag the topics of the individual instances. But you can look at this list of controversial issues in Wikipedia articles yourself. Really, there are a lot of different topics. A lot of them are political, some are religious. What else is there? Yeah, about celebrities, about some kind of weird hoaxes. There are all kinds of things in there. Yeah.
Topics are very broad.
Yes, the topics are very broad.
How do you expect that LLM can be confused? How much how much a model can be confused. But in this topic, it seems like a model can be confused with a temporally or like with a different perspective views. But with it in the opposite direction, how do you
Yeah, with a domain-specific model, it's of course more difficult because a language model might not know all that much about the topic to start with, right? Yeah, it of course depends on the language model. So then it's more difficult to evaluate if it doesn't even have any idea of different answers for domain-specific questions.
data sets on
I don't think so. I mean, this is still a relatively new topic, this whole thing about disputable facts and knowledge conflicts. So I'm not aware of any specific domain-specific data sets on that. I think there are some scientific fact-checking data sets. That's something we also thought about, and there it's more kind of niche knowledge. But we didn't try to adapt those to for evaluating disputable facts. But maybe that's where I would start if I wanted to build one.
Maybe data surrounded copy or data. So do you think is it enough as like a ground knowledge or do you think the first we need to like move from Wikipedia or maybe like gather some other knowledge sources for grounding this?
Yeah, the question was if Wikipedia is enough as a source of knowledge for these kinds of evaluation settings. And I definitely think that it's not. When Haun and Sarah, the two PhD students, when they suggested that we use Wikipedia, I wasn't 100% happy about it because there is so much work on Wikipedia, but it's really the easiest thing to do if there's absolutely nothing that's been done in the area yet, and that's why we ended up using that. But I think future work should definitely look into more maybe domain-specific facts, maybe things that change regionally or geographically. I think that'd be really interesting, but it's just a bit difficult to collect and do this automatically. Then it would require some manual efforts.
I have a general question I think may be helpful to many of the students about sort of future of what you presented. So attribution, for instance. So when you find out or when you do such analysis for, you know, what is responsible, a certain training data set or data points for certain neurons, then what do you expect to do with that result?
Yes. So one of the things that can be looked at is knowledge editing for neurons. So when you find out some neuron is responsible for something you don't want it to be responsible for example, and for identifying useful instances. If you find that the most influential training instances aren't connected to what you want them to be connected to, again, you want to maybe change your training data set. So it's really for these kind of debugging purposes on the model level.
So just kind of a detail about that research. Certain neurons or certain instances, do they depend on the training itself? So like when you find that, you know, this instance is responsible, does it matter how you actually did the pre-training or the fine-tuning? And if so, you know, what you find during using that analysis, is it generalized? How to what extent can you say it's general?
Well, we found similar trends across 3 different language models. So I think that the findings themselves are robust to different training, different language models. But in general, this thing about what knowledge do different language models identify and so on. And of course, it depends on how they're trained. but yeah, we didn't check this. We didn't, for example, check different versions of OPT and check if they have, if that results in any overlapping neurons or such. We could have done that. Yes.
I guess my general such study of looking at like attribution without having this power to pre-train do the pre-training and fine-tuning yourself, it's really difficult to say like what you I understand it's really hard to do anything beyond that, but just as a field I'm just kind of concerned, like how much can we understand, how much can we learn without having access to the entire.
Yes, absolutely. There's only so much we can do, and I think the best thing is then to look for models which different versions exist, maybe different checkpoints if possible, but then also just different versions, different sizes, and so on. I think that can already tell us a little bit about what might be going on. But of course, it's not as good as directly having access and directly training them and doing it during training.
So I think let's thank Isabelle one more time. Let me use the microphone. So for those who are joining online, so thank you everyone for joining, and thank you again, Isabelle, for a really great talk. I think her talk raised more questions, at least for me, raised more questions, which is great because then we'll have a lot more research to do. So I know some of you may be interested in talking individually with Isabelle. As she said before, she's here until at least Friday, I think. So if you want to come talk now, or maybe set up an appointment to talk with her individually later. All right, thank you.
And that'll also be at ACL.
She'll be at ACL.